this shit. We really are. And there will be no narrative that I will not prod when it comes to figuring out why people are lying about the state that Charlie was in when it came.
What happens when a movement starts questioning itself publicly? Because this time, the pressure didn't come from critics on the outside. It came from inside the house. After alleged claims from a so-called whistleblower connected to Turning Point USA began circulating online, the conversation took a sharp turn when Candace Owens appeared to directly call out Erika Kirk. And fans immediately realized this wasn't just another internet spat. This felt different. Candace didn't frame her comments as gossip. She didn't sound reactive. She sounded deliberate, and that's why people paid attention. According to clips now circulating, Candace questioned consistency, accountability, and who gets protected when uncomfortable information surfaces. She didn't confirm the whistleblower's claims. She didn't lay out documents. Instead, she challenged the silence, and in doing so, shifted the focus from allegations to credibility. That move split the audience instantly. Some viewers praised her for saying what others wouldn't. Others accused her of amplifying unverified claims. And many asked the same question at the same time: if this wasn't serious, why respond at all? Because when a high-profile figure speaks up internally, the story stops being about rumors and starts being about fractures. Fractures in trust, fractures in alignment, fractures in how truth is handled when it becomes inconvenient. And once those fractures are visible, the internet doesn't wait for answers. It starts drawing conclusions. So the real question isn't what did the whistleblower say? It's why did Candace Owens feel compelled to address it publicly? The word whistleblower carries instant weight. It suggests risk, insider access, and truth breaking through pressure. That's why the moment online posts began describing a TPUSA whistleblower, audiences assumed something serious had surfaced, even before understanding what was actually being claimed. Here's how the story unfolded. According to timelines reconstructed from public posts and reaction clips, the first references did not arrive as a formal disclosure. There were no affidavits, no filings, no named investigators. Instead, the claims appeared as second-hand summaries, captions saying "an insider says," reaction videos repeating according to a whistleblower, and screenshots of messages presented as internal context. The framing did most of the work. What were the claims about? Broadly, they centered on process and accountability, not a single provable act. Viewers were told there were concerns about how information was handled internally, how decisions were communicated, and whether uncomfortable questions were being addressed consistently. Importantly, the claims circulated without a unified document. Different creators highlighted different angles, which meant the audience never saw one complete, verifiable account, only fragments. That fragmentation mattered. Without a single source to scrutinize, audiences relied on repetition as validation. If multiple creators referenced the whistleblower, it felt real. If the same themes echoed across clips, it felt corroborated. In practice, many of those echoes traced back to the same small cluster of posts, amplified again and again. Another accelerant was timing. The claims emerged amid existing scrutiny around Erika Kirk and her association with Turning Point USA. When a narrative is already warm, it doesn't need much fuel to ignite. The whistleblower framing provided that fuel. What the claims didn't include is just as important as what they did. No named whistleblower stepping forward publicly, no primary documents authenticated by an independent outlet, no official acknowledgement validating the claims, yet the story advanced rapidly because of how it was told. Language drift played a central role. Early posts used qualifiers, allegedly, according to unverified. As the story spread, those qualifiers fell away. The audience began debating responses and consequences instead of authenticity and scope. That's the moment a claim starts behaving like a fact online. Then came the turning point. Candace Owens addressed the situation. She didn't confirm the whistleblower's claims. She didn't present documents. What she did was question consistency and transparency, and that alone elevated the story. When a high-profile internal voice engages, audiences infer seriousness. The question shifts from "is this real?" to "why is this being addressed?" That inference is powerful and risky. Candace's comments reframed the narrative from external rumor to internal accountability. Supporters saw courage, critics saw amplification, neutral viewers saw a crack. Regardless of interpretation, her involvement changed the stakes. It suggested the issue wasn't just gossip. It was about trust within a movement. Another reason the story spread is whistleblower ambiguity. When the source remains unnamed, audiences imagine the worst, or the most dramatic. Anonymity can protect sources, but it also removes the audience's ability to assess credibility. Online, that trade-off often favors belief over skepticism. This is where identity alignment stepped in. Viewers interpreted the claims based on their prior trust in the people involved. Those already critical accepted the whistleblower framing readily. Those supportive demanded proof. The same absence of evidence supported opposite conclusions. And through it all, silence from official channels filled the gaps. No comprehensive statement addressing the substance of the circulating claims meant speculation continued. As before, silence was read as strategy or confirmation, depending on perspective. This part of the story isn't about deciding who's right. It's about understanding how a whistleblower narrative can solidify without verification. The combination of anonymity, repetition, timing, and internal acknowledgement creates momentum that's hard to slow. In the next part, we'll examine why Candace Owens' call-out mattered so much, how internal criticism reshapes public perception, and why movements struggle most when accountability questions come from within. Until Candace Owens spoke up, the story lived in a familiar place. Reaction videos, anonymous claims, and speculative threads. It was noisy but contained. What changed wasn't the information, it was who acknowledged it. Candace's call-out mattered because it came from inside the ecosystem. She wasn't framed as an outsider attacking a movement. She was seen as someone with proximity, history, and influence. That positioning instantly elevated the conversation from rumor to internal accountability debate. Importantly, Candace did not present herself as a judge. She didn't declare guilt. She didn't validate the whistleblower's claims as fact. Instead, she questioned process, how concerns are handled, who gets clarity, and why silence appears when questions become uncomfortable. That framing is subtle but powerful. It moves the focus from what happened to how truth is managed. For supporters, her comments felt like integrity. They saw someone willing to ask hard questions publicly rather than protect optics privately. For critics, the same comments felt irresponsible, a megaphone for unverified claims. Neutral viewers saw something else entirely, a fracture. Movements can absorb external criticism. They struggle with internal doubt. That's why this moment hit harder than previous allegations involving Erika Kirk. When Candace spoke, the story wasn't just about Erika anymore. It was about standards. Who is held to them, who enforces them, and what happens when enforcement appears selective. Another reason the call-out changed everything was tone. Candace wasn't emotional, she was measured. Calm criticism carries authority. It signals confidence rather than reaction. Viewers interpreted that calm as seriousness, even though no new facts were introduced. Tone became testimony. Once that happened, audiences began reassessing earlier silence differently. What once looked like ignoring online noise now looked like avoiding internal scrutiny. Again, perception shifted without evidence changing. The call-out also triggered audience sorting. People chose sides not based on documents but based on trust in voices. If you trusted Candace, you leaned toward skepticism of silence. If you trusted TPUSA leadership, you questioned her motives. Either way, the debate intensified. This is the danger and power of internal critique. It multiplies interpretations. Another overlooked factor is expectation asymmetry. Audiences expect whistleblowers to speak loudly and institutions to respond quickly. When that doesn't happen, they assume imbalance. Candace's intervention filled that perceived imbalance. She became the voice asking what others weren't. But asking questions publicly has consequences. Questions don't remain questions online. They get answered by the crowd. Once Candace raised concerns, reaction creators framed them as confirmation. Headlines simplified nuance. Calls out became exposes. Questions became accuses. The narrative hardened again, not because Candace escalated it, but because virality did. This part of the story isn't about whether Candace was right or wrong to speak. It's about why her voice carried disproportionate weight. Internal critique feels like permission. Once given, the audience feels justified drawing conclusions on its own. And that's where control is lost. In the next part, we look at how Erika Kirk became the focal point, why individuals often absorb institutional pressure, and how personal accountability narratives form even when claims are systemic. Once Candace Owens raised questions publicly, the conversation needed a focal point. Online narratives rarely stay abstract for long. Systems are too complex, processes are too boring. Audiences want a face, and in this case, that face became Erika Kirk. This is a familiar pattern. When controversies involve organizations, whistleblowers, or internal culture, pressure almost always collapses downward onto an individual. It's easier to tell a story about a person than a structure, easier to assign intent, easier to demand consequences. Erika's visibility, role, and previous association with TPUSA made her a natural lightning rod, regardless of what the whistleblower claims actually addressed. At this stage, the narrative stopped asking what is broken and started asking who is responsible. That shift matters. The whistleblower framing was broad, about transparency, consistency, and internal handling of concerns. But those themes are abstract, they don't trend, they don't generate thumbnails. Erika, as a recognizable figure, did, so the focus narrowed. This narrowing wasn't necessarily malicious, it was algorithmic. Content that centers on a named individual performs better than content about institutional processes. Reactions intensified once her name appeared in titles, captions, and thumbnails. Each repetition strengthened the association, even though the underlying claims hadn't changed. Another reason Erika became central is role confusion. Online discussions often conflate visibility with authority. Being public-facing gets mistaken for being decision-making. Viewers assume that if someone is visible, they must control outcomes. In reality, organizational influence is rarely that simple, but nuance doesn't survive virality. Once Erika was positioned as the focal point, motive speculation followed. People began asking why rather than how. Motive questions are powerful because they don't require evidence, they invite imagination. And imagination fills gaps quickly. At the same time, identity alignment shaped interpretation. For some viewers, criticizing Erika symbolized accountability within a movement. For others, defending her symbolized resistance to internal division. The individual became a proxy for larger ideological conflicts. That's when pressure escalates. Every silence, every non-statement, every delayed response gets read as strategy. Even neutral actions get interpreted. At this point, an individual isn't just responding to claims, they're responding to a story that has outgrown its source. This is where scapegoating risk appears. Scapegoating doesn't require falsehood, it requires simplification. Complex issues get reduced to one person's name so the audience can process anger, disappointment, or betrayal efficiently. The system stays intact, the individual absorbs the impact. Importantly, there's no evidence presented publicly that the whistleblower claims targeted Erika personally. Yet the narrative evolved as if they did, because audiences prefer clarity over accuracy. Another dynamic at play is symbolic accountability. People want to see consequences. If systems don't visibly change, individuals become stand-ins for change. Removing or condemning a person feels like action, even if it doesn't address underlying issues. This is why individuals often become the endpoint of institutional controversies, not because they caused them, but because they're visible enough to carry the outcome. For Erika, this meant being discussed less as a person and more as a representation. Representation of silence, representation of internal conflict, representation of how truth is handled when it's uncomfortable. Once someone becomes a symbol, they lose control of their narrative. This part of the story isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about why focus narrows the way it does online. The internet isn't designed for systemic accountability. It's designed for engagement. And engagement favors names, faces, and simplified arcs. In the final part, we'll step back and ask the hardest question. What happens to truth when internal criticism goes public? And can movements survive accountability without tearing themselves apart? When internal criticism becomes public, something fundamental shifts. The conversation stops being about improvement and starts being about survival of trust, alignment, and identity. That's the stage this story reached once questions raised by Candace Owens intersected with whistleblower framing and focused attention on Erika Kirk. At this point, facts matter less than fracture. Movements are built on shared belief, not unanimous agreement. But when disagreements spill into public view, audiences interpret them as cracks, even if they're part of healthy internal debate. What should look like accountability begins to look like instability. And instability makes people nervous. That nervousness fuels reaction. Supporters feel compelled to defend the movement, sometimes by dismissing questions outright. Critics feel validated, seeing the public disagreement as confirmation of deeper problems. Neutral observers sense disarray and step back. Each response is rational from its position, and collectively they widen the gap. This is the cost of public accountability. Clarity for some, confusion for others. For the individuals involved, the cost is personal. Once a person becomes a symbol of internal conflict, every action they take is interpreted through that lens. Silence is strategic, speaking is political. There's no neutral ground left. Can trust be rebuilt after that? Sometimes, but not quickly. Rebuilding trust requires more than statements. It requires process, transparency, and time. It requires showing how concerns are handled, not just asserting that they are. But those processes don't translate well online. They're slow, procedural, and unglamorous. They don't trend. That's why many movements choose quiet resolution over public explanation. Unfortunately, quiet resolution looks like avoidance to an audience primed for answers. This creates a paradox. The steps that rebuild trust internally often erode trust externally. Another challenge is narrative permanence. Once a story like this enters the public consciousness, it doesn't disappear when attention fades. It becomes a reference point, cited, summarized, and simplified over time. Future conversations start from that memory, not from original nuance. This is why internal fractures are so risky. They don't need to be catastrophic to be lasting. They just need to be visible. What this story ultimately reveals isn't a verdict, it's a vulnerability. Movements struggle most not when critics attack them, but when insiders question them publicly. That tension exposes the limits of alignment and the difficulty of balancing loyalty with honesty. For audiences, the lesson is uncomfortable. Not every unresolved story has a villain. Sometimes there are only questions, processes, and people navigating them imperfectly. The internet prefers certainty. Reality often offers none. For public figures, the lesson is harsher. Once a narrative escapes into the wild, you no longer control how it ends. You can only decide how you participate, loudly, quietly, or not at all. And for movements, the lesson is structural. Accountability that isn't communicated gets mistaken for absence. Communication that isn't careful gets mistaken for confirmation. There is no flawless path, only trade-offs. Do you think public call-outs strengthen accountability or fracture movements beyond repair? Should internal issues ever be handled online, or does that guarantee distortion? Drop your thoughts in the comments with respect. Share this if you believe accountability should seek truth, not just traction. Because once trust cracks publicly, rebuilding it privately becomes the hardest work of all.